Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to Millions of Conversations event, A Future of the South, a discussion with the next voting generation. We're very excited about this topic, especially because at Millions of Conversations, we work very hard to bring Americans together around commonly shared values. And one of the ways we do that is through conversation and through platforms like this and events like this. So we were really excited when Michael Gordon contacted us and said that he wanted to create an event that highlighted the opinions and perspectives of the most undervalued and overlooked demographic, the youth voice. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce you today, Mr. Michael Gordon, who was born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee, is a senior at the University School of Nashville, and self-identifies as a member of the Nashville Jewish community. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Summer, for the introduction. Before we start, and I introduce all the panelists, I want to really quickly go over what we've going on at the bottom of your screen. So if you want to chat with any of the panelists, if you have any troubles with anything, go to chat, and then all panelists, feel free to text us there. If you have any questions for the Q&A section at the end, there's the Q&A button, type it in there, and we'll all see the question, and then for the last 30 or so minutes, we'll go over that. So without further ado, I'll introduce all of our awesome panelists. So Maya Kasim.
Hi, my name is Maya Kazim. I'm a senior in high school with Michael. I'm really excited to have conversations about this House place in criminal justice. And also talk about how law, race, gender, and sexuality kind of interact with systems of oppression. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya, for that. Going to Jordan Winbush.
Oh, Lord. Here we go. All right, my name is Jordan. I'm a senior in high school at USN with Michael. I'm interested to join the facets of systems of oppression that exist in America.
Thank you, Jordan, for that. We're going to move on to Wiley Barzilay.
I'm Wiley Barzilay. I'm a rising senior, also living in Nashville, Tennessee. I think the event is important just because it's important to have conversations about these issues. I think that's a key aspect of progress. And I think what drew me to this event was the opportunity not only to discuss, but also to just listen and learn about people's experiences and issues.
Thank you so much, Wiley, for that introduction. We're going to go to Isha Karam.
Hi there, my name is Isha Karam, and I'm also a senior at University School of Nashville with Michael. And I think that the reason that I was drawn to this event was because I think that a big part of progress involves seeking out new and different perspectives on these issues. And that's the reason I'm here today, both to share and to listen. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Isha, for that introduction. Now we'll move on to Nia Adeogun.
Hi, my name is Nia Adigan. I am so happy to be part of this event. I live in Houston, Texas, specifically Katy, and I was drawn to this event because it's an opportunity to share thoughts that I wouldn't normally get to share, and it's an opportunity to gain perspective about, what everyone else is saying and talking about the topics of our time that are considered kind of taboo. But I'm really excited, and thank you.
Thank you, Nia. We'll go to Marley Thompson next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marley Thompson. I live in Birmingham, Alabama. I'm a senior in high school. And I think I'm really excited just because right now and so recently, it's not really a choice whether or not we can be involved. We have to be, just for the sake of goodness. And I think that to be involved, we need to be informed. And these conversations are a great way to get informed and to learn what you should believe in, why you believe in it, and just what you need to do to get to the next step.
Thank you, Marley, for that. Now we'll go to the final person, Luke Kim.
Hey, I'm Luke Kim. I'm a sophomore at the University School of Nashville in Nashville, Tennessee. And I decided to do this because I think having a dialogue is one of the most important things to do when it comes to issues like this that are so broad and expansive, because a dialogue can allow us to kind of create a collective understanding. And I hope someone sees this and they might change their mind or, understand the entire issue better. So.
Thank you, everyone, for your introductions. Now I'll welcome you all back on to Zoom. And we can start our first portion of today, which is the discussion. We're waiting on one person, I think, and then we'll be ready to go. I think his internet might be down right now, so I think he might pop on when, oh wait, there we go, boom. Okay, now everyone is on. Okay, perfect. So we'll start today with an opening question that everyone will answer. So the question is, what systems of oppression are there and whose responsibility within the civic dialogue is it to dismantle them and break them down? We'll start with Luke Kim over to my left.
I think that, I mean, I can't name every single one. There are a ton, I guess, just starting from where this conversation started is policing. I think policing is one of the biggest systems of oppression there is because it is the literal enforcement of laws that even themselves can be seen as a system of oppression. And I think that even though I can't name all of them, I think it is my responsibility and everyone else's responsibility to dismantle them and to work towards actual progress in the future. Just because, you know, it's everyone's job and it'll benefit everyone. So.
Thank you, Luke. We'll move on to Wiley Barzilay for the next answer.
So yeah, I definitely agree with Luke that there are way too many systems of oppression to name. But I think that every system of oppression that is named is sort of interconnected. So obviously you have your prison industrial complex, your military industrial complex. I totally agree. The institution of policing. You have sort of like a broader system of probably neoliberal capitalism also oppressing people. And I think that it is all of our responsibilities as youth, as citizens, as Americans to, you know, attempt to dismantle those systems, or at least sort of think about them in a way where we question their validity or usefulness.
Thank you, Wiley. We'll go to Mila next.
Hi, I guess that question's really good in terms of like systems of oppression. I guess I'll name a few, the ones that come to mind for me, at least, like white supremacy, colonialism, like sexism and gender inequality, and like anti-Blackness. Of course, I feel like these things are really important because I think that interacts within the broader conversation about criminal justice reform. Because I don't think people realize how much of those institutions it touches. Some other systems of oppression that I feel like people don't talk a lot about is ableism, partly in the fact that it's like really normalized in our day-to-day society. And I think that in terms of whose obligation it is, I think that for like different types of repression, more people are more obligated because they tend to benefit more from it. For example, in the context of ableism, you've got able-bodied folks. In the context of white supremacy, you've got white folks. But I think that within those systems and how they interact with each other, everyone has a stake in it. Therefore, it's everyone's obligation to help deconstruct it in the best way they can.
Thank you, Milo. We'll go to Marley next.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's everyone's kind of job to do it. And I also think when you talk to me about like systematic oppression, I'm thinking like things in the system that are like directly affecting minorities and especially non-white folks. And I think especially you think about like redlining and the school to prison pipeline and policing and the prison industrial complex, those things all kind of feed into each other. And I think it's important that you can't get rid of one of them and not the other. So we can't get rid of policing without also getting rid of the school to prison pipeline and redlining, because schools in those neighborhoods are not as good, and there's this whole kind of interconnectivity with them. And so I think that we need to recognize, all of us, it's our job to dismantle it, and to do that we need to recognize that all of them kind of fit together, and it's important that we get rid of all of them and not just one.
Thank you for that, Marley. We'll go to Nia next.
Yeah, so I think that there are so many systems of oppression, and I think that they're honestly, like, to go down a list and name all of them would just be absurd because there's there's just so many, and they're everywhere. You can literally be driving past neighborhoods within your own high school. Everywhere you can look, there's a system of oppression. I definitely think that it's up to the people, just like Maya was saying, in specific groups, they're more inclined to battle these systems of oppression, whereas like just kind of like the BLM movement, there are white allies, but most people, minorities, Black people, are helping to fight that fight on the front lines, but you also have those allies. So there's more of an incline to the people that's affecting directly. However, it's society's job as a whole to be battling these problems at the front.
Thank you, Nia. We'll go to Isha next.
Yeah, I just want to echo what everyone else was saying. There are definitely so many systems of oppression, some that we think about every day and some that we don't really acknowledge to the fullest extent. And I also think that a lot of the times there are groups of people who may not exactly identify as a victim or as an oppressor, but who still need to be involved in dismantling those systems. So I think that that's a huge part, is even those groups who don't really feel obligated to or have a personal stake in dismantling them. I think even those groups need to play an active role in that.
Thank you, Isha. And then we'll end with Jordan for this question.
I think that there are everybody else has said active in the U.S. and around the world. For example, redlining school to prison pipeline, prison industrial complex, etc. And I think that it's everybody's job as a human being to be able to treat other human beings equally, and therefore it is everybody's job to try and fight these systems of oppression.
Thank you, Jordan. Now we will move on to our questions that will not be answered by everyone. So the next question is, what makes the Southeast and the South in general a unique place within the context of BLM, police brutality, and issues within kind of the racism sphere? So we will start with Nia for this one. Take us away.
All right, so like I mentioned in my intro, I live in Houston, Texas, which is not necessarily Southeast, but I still consider myself for the South. I definitely think that whenever people think of the South, they have this huge stereotype on their mind, slavery, Confederate flags, just a bunch of people in trucks, and I think that there's a lot of people that live in the South that want to uphold that legacy. Therefore, we push all these values out in the South. However, I think there's an other side to the South where it's a lot of teens like us and teens that are having this conversation today, and especially the next voting generation, that have this new perspective on life and new perspective on how the South should be and how we should be moving forward and making progression. So I think it's unique in the way that there's two completely different sides and they're all trying to interact together and find the common ground in a way, and sharing their opinions, sharing their views, and at the end of the day, trying to come to something that is moving forward and is in forward motion and positive for the South as a whole.
Thank you, Nia, for that. Luke, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think Nia touched on this a little bit when it came to the heritage thing, but there is a deep history in the South, especially the Southeast, of slavery, Jim Crow, current police brutality in the South. And I think that what makes it unique is that, as Nia said, a lot of people in the South, they don't want to have that heritage. And I think that, especially with this new wave of voters, as we are the future voters of the next generation, a lot of these voters, a lot of the younger people are kind of teaming up with those who don't like the heritage, who want change, the stereotype. And it's really making for a unique kind of mix of action, we saw in Georgia in 2018 when Stacey Abrams almost won in a fully red state. So
thank you, Luke. Does anyone else have anything they want to add in, chime in based on what they heard, or
Yeah, I want to add something real quick. I think with that heritage kind of thing we're going on is that, being from Birmingham, we have such a history of that we were such a hotspot in the civil rights movement, the Birmingham bus boycotts and everything like that. We have so much history of being progressive. So I think it's important to realize that the Southeast not only has that history of slavery and racism and the Confederacy and all that, we also have such a rich history of progressivism and like dismantling those systems. So that's another really important thing to remember, is that like we have that power and like we have that drive.
Do you guys think that it's important, kind of as we've seen from Nia, Luke, and Marley, that, you know, there's this heritage that everyone around the U.S. kind of thinks that we're backwards and not the most progressive? Do you think it's our responsibility then to be the forefront of change, to kind of show that these systems can and will be dismantled?
I think that's really like kind of an important conversation to have, but I also think that when people conceptualize that, it's kind of weird in a way, and I feel like it kind of plays into something like a little classist, I think, in a sense. So I feel like there's a stereotype of the South that's like, oh, they're all backwards and like Southern people and stuff like that, and I feel like that's kind of a way of elevating the North, where they're like, oh, we're the elite, we're the most important people in terms of this conversation. But I also think that's a smokescreen and a cover for a lot of the racism that happens in the North, but also kind of a disavowal of the civil rights movement, how like the civil rights movement being based in the South, most of our most important like activists kind of being like real based in the South, for example, like Diane Nash, Fannie Lou Hamer, like it's like you can't have this conversation without the South, and to disavow and tell the South that you can't be a part of this conversation and that you're the sole perpetrator is a fundamental misunderstanding of how racism and white supremacy has operated in this country.
I agree with Milo, honestly. I think the South and the North are both equally as racist, but the way that the South is way more upfront about racism in terms of, you know, flying Confederate flags. You know, there's still, the Klan still has rallies actually in and around the Southeast. But, you know, if I remember correctly, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. I mean, it doesn't change the South being loud and proud about our racism per se does not change the fact that the North does have racism as well.
That was a really good point. What do you guys think about do you think that because it is louder here, it's almost kind of taken for granted? Like, because, you know, people, obviously the racism that exists in the police force and more generally has existed, you know, forever, but it only really picked up steam when it was, you know, displayed in the North rather than the South, because there were a couple, like Ahmaud Arbery, wasn't he in the South? And I think Breonna Taylor, of course, was in Kentucky. Like, do you think that those events finally kind of breaking the news bubble in the North would have affected it at all?
I think that, I mean, you have a point when you say that all these other killings were, like, for example, Eric Garner basically yelling, "I can't breathe," if somebody killed him. And I don't think there is no difference, to me at least, between his and George Floyd's death. I think you do have a point when you say that, you know, it reached the police killings, quote unquote, reached the North, and that it was viewed as different, because it's Minnesota. But I do think you have a point with that, yeah.
Does anyone else want to take on this question before we move on to the next one?
I'll just add a little something. I completely agree with you. I think that in the South, especially like from the perspective of the North, almost like, you know, they kind of expect things like Ahmaud Arbery. Like I know people because of extracurriculars I do outside of the South, and they were, I think some of their responses were like close to, oh, like welcome to like the South or Alabama, or I think they misplaced where it happened. I believe it happened in Georgia, but like I think there is kind of the stereotype, and because that exists of just outward racism in the South, that racism that happens in the South is minimized in comparison to what happens in the North.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is a good thing. Speaking of social media, reaching out to people that are not within our direct area, our next question is going to be, what do you see the role of social media in this context as? And we will start with Milo for that question.
Yeah. Okay, so I think social media is a double-edged sword in the sense of the way we can use it. I think it can be a good resource in terms of like, I've seen a lot of people be able to organize mutual aid networks, which are really good for supporting communities outside the systems of policing and like exploitation. I've also seen people being able to broadcast their needs for housing, for example, queer and trans folks who have been kicked out of their own houses and they need ways and GoFundMe's to get like funding and through donations and stuff like that. But I do think that there is a bit of a damaging aspect to social media because like from at least my perspective as a young person being on Instagram, like news like really goes quickly and spreads like wildfire. And sometimes like you aren't able to check the validity of those sources and stuff like that. I also do think that I've seen with a lot of people, there isn't a translation between social media activism and also like real life activism. But when I mean real life, I mean like in the sense of participating in like things, like participating in an event like this. I would consider that real life. Not my distinction of social media is like, let's post a photo of something that's happening, I guess. So I think that I'd like to see more translation because, for example, in the context of where I operate, we've had events and we've had like a ton of people like show up and stuff like that. But sometimes we've had people show up, but not as much as we've seen people reposting things and stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's a double-edged sword. We should keep on using it in Corona just because like it's a question of access. There are people who literally physically can't go out because they have like pre-existing conditions. So I want to be that person that's like, don't use social media. It's like some of you have to.
What do y'all think about specifically within social media, the kind of proliferation and the spreading of like videos of people being tortured or beaten or killed by the police? I've heard, people say that it's helpful for getting out the information and kind of sparking awareness. I've heard that it's a form of modern lynching. I don't know. Nia, do you want to take this?
So I think it's definitely I love that Mario used the double-edged sword type of to comparison, because nobody really wants to go on their Instagram and look at videos like that, because a lot of times they are very just like wow, I never knew. But at the same time, there are a lot of people that never know these things are going on in the world. Like they outside of Instagram know, or Instagram, whatever social you want to choose, no, it's not the most accurate way to get information, but however you are seeing these videos, you are seeing that this is something that's happening in the world. And I think it kind of calls people to action sometimes, because it's like, I live this such nice life, and I get to see outside of where I live something that's, wherever you want, what continent you pick, whether it's the US or outside of it, there are things that are going on. And I feel like social media pushes that out, and in a positive way, but also in a negative way. Double-edged sword, very much so.
Luke, I know you want to add on this as well. What would you like to say about this?
Yeah, I know, to your question about is it a modern lynching or is it positive, I lean more towards the modern lynching in the sense that no one wants, as Nia said, to go see someone, be brutalized on social media. That's not, what social media was made for. But at the same time, to Nia's point, it is one of the better ways to spread awareness. But I think where my problem comes in is I don't think awareness comes by showing videos of someone getting shot in the street or someone getting, strangled. I think that it's almost disrespectful to the victim. I think that, having all these eyes on, the last moment someone died is, while it can drive action, I think that can be done in other ways. I know a lot of people after Breonna Taylor was killed, reposted drawings of her, or pictures of her at her best. And I think for me, that's a better alternative. So, but I don't think that videos of people getting, shot, strangled, killed is the best thing to be spreading. So.
I know I've talked with you a little bit about this, Wiley, and I saw you nodding your head when Maya was talking about it. Would you be able to speak a little bit about kind of the, not necessity, but the real value of some of the things being posted, like if they really drive people to action that is meaningful?
Yeah, I think it definitely depends like on what is being posted. Like if like Blackout Tuesday, I feel like was probably not incredibly productive because you're providing no information. You're providing it's just you're literally saying essentially nothing. Like I feel like that is probably not as helpful as providing, like as Maya said, like mutual aid networks or just providing information about things that happened. I also kind of agree with what Luke was saying that like posting videos is probably not incredibly helpful because I think the implication of that is that like you as a viewer have to see these things to believe them. And I think like that's kind of messed up. Like I think most of us should be able to like, if given the information, like for example, in Breonna Taylor's case, and just believe that that happened. Like the idea that someone needs to physically see that violence to even acknowledge it, I think is a little bit messed up.
I want to move on to the next one just because we have a lot to go over. I think next we're going to go on to with a global pandemic currently, occurring, as everyone knows. I mean, we're on Zoom right now. How have you all, as teens, been able to participate in the movement and educate yourself, and just keep up and be a positive force? We'll start with Marley for this one.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting time, like for everyone, and I think what's really cool is that like we have so many outlets. Like I think that social media, people have really learned how to use it for good. And so we've had a couple protests here in Birmingham. People wearing masks, bringing their own water to make sure we don't have to drink or take from other people. I was able to stay away from big crowds, but we only had a couple because some were canceled by the KKK. That was a thing that happened to us. But, and I also think that like there's so many resources out there. There's Netflix movies, there's books, there's podcasts, there's people you can follow on Instagram, like activists you follow on Instagram. Like I think it's so accessible to us to learn about activism that it's like there's no excuse not to, I think. And I think that like I have been focusing on watching movies that I have never considered before, like maybe watching or listening to things I'd seen before, but looking at them in a different way, kind of. Because I've seen the movie, like the documentary 13th many times, but watching it recently, you see it with a new lens of like how it's really happening, and like you feel more affected by it. And I think that's me checking my own privilege, is that I never saw these things before.
Nia, I know you wanted to also speak on this.
I've gotten to go to protests out here, and like I mentioned before, I live in Katy, so it's a little bit smaller than the Houston area. So all of our protests out here are very safe, and not a lot of people, but enough people to be like, wow, like change is happening. I definitely think that we have to, I'm sorry. Yes, I definitely agree with Marley in the way that there's a lot of time right now to educate yourself, like watch something new, listen to a new podcast, read a new book. There are so many resources out there that are pushing all of these new information in light of the BLM movement and everything else that's going on, just so that you have something to do when you're at home. Because, I mean, what is the better time? We're not in school, we're not busy, everyone's at home. Like, this is your time to educate yourself and do good things. Read that new, like I was saying, read that new book, watch that new movie. Netflix is awesome. They have a ton. They even have like a section that's like, movies related to the BLM movement. Like, scroll through, find something you like. It's good information.
So does anyone else want to speak on this last question?
I just wanted to add something. I think that also this is a great time to like sign petitions. They take they're so easy to sign, and like just finding one that works for you, and like maybe not the change.org ones, but there's White House petitions that still need signatures. And I think that's really, it's so quick to do. I also think that like learning about the intersectionality of all of the systems of oppression going on, like, not only do Black lives matter, but Black trans lives matter, Black disabled lives matter, Black Jewish lives matter, like learning about that intersectionality, because I think sometimes we forget about that. We talk about podcasts of like, oh, these are Black owned, but think about like the experiences of like different people within that community, I think.
Another thing that I want to add before we go on to the next question is if you can find, specific protest groups or movements in your area that a lot of times they need, supplies. Like I know at the Justin Jones in Nashville at IWL's Plaza. They're protesting right now. They've been sitting out there for, I think, maybe 60 days. I don't know the exact number, but they're always looking for new supplies, water, tents, stuff like that. So check in with activists in your area, see if there's anything that they need specifically, even if you can't go out and protest with them, to help them stay afloat. Thank you everyone for responding to that question. Does anyone else have anything they want to say, or should we move on to, let's go on to the next one then. So kind of relating to the pandemic, do you think that the pandemic has exacerbated or worsened or kind of flared up the civil rights movement again since 2016, or do you think it was going to happen now anyway? We'll start with Nia on this one. We'll start with Isha on this one. My bad.
Yeah, I would say like it's definitely exposed a lot of the underlying like problems that we've already been facing for a long time now, and I think that like what we've seen with the pandemic specifically and like COVID-19 rates among minorities, I think it's just like a symptom of the problem that we've been facing for a long time now. Like I think that we've always known that like minority groups are more vulnerable to like certain diseases, and I think that the pandemic has kind of exacerbated and maybe like brought to light a lot of like oppression that was already going on.
Luke, do you want to kind of further what she was saying, or?
Yeah, I think the pandemic has made it a lot worse, mostly because, and I guess this might be your next question, but it really does exaggerate the systems of oppression that exist. Because if you can't get a loan, if you're poor, live in a Black community, can't get a loan because your community's been redlined, and you have to go work a job, you're probably going to get coronavirus. And if you're in that situation, you probably can't afford healthcare. You probably can't afford, the insane cost of, going to a hospital nowadays. And so I think that because of how particularly a disease impacts people, that more people are getting impacted because of like the systems of oppressions that exist. And I also think that, what comes with a pandemic is something like more power. And I know that a lot of governors are taking up more power. I know that the president has even claimed to have like total authority. I know that can be a slippery slope, and that magnifies systems of oppression. I know in Nashville, we had a homeless Black man be arrested for not wearing a mask and then held on cash bail that he could not pay. While tons of other people, if you drive through, don't have masks on. I think that's just an example of how the pandemic really, exposes and intensifies the current crisis.
I'm gonna try and add on to that. I'm gonna try and add on to that really quickly about what Luke said about the homeless guy that got arrested. He was, I think, the first man arrested for a mask violation in the city of Nashville, but literally 3 days beforehand, there were two white guys with beers in their hands, no masks on, taking pictures of officers on Broadway. And if anything, they're more, well, I'm not going to say they're more or less of a problem, but they're out downtown drinking, getting drunk, hanging out with friends, and exposing more people technically to COVID than that homeless guy is when he's just minding his business. That and what Luke said about the whole pandemic highlighting systems of oppression that exist, say in the medical field, and it highlights systems of oppression that exist in other places, such as, like you said, if you work one at Burger King and the other at like Five Guys or something like that, none of those give you health insurance. So if you want to go get a COVID test, you have to pay out of pocket for that. And you got to pay for an ER visit or something like that, and it's just really expensive. And like you said, it's not helping people at all.
Milo, I'm curious to hear from you. What if you had to pick kind of one, like obviously there are many, but if one thing that right now you think is contributing the most to the increased rate of COVID infection in minorities and kind of the exacerbation there, what would you pick?
I feel like That's a really good question. I guess, do you want me to be like contextual? Because I feel like it's like everything. That's the thing, like with COVID-19, is that it just like amplifies every specific thing that like kind of we've kind of been dealing with. I guess I'll go kind of with your question and say probably access to healthcare, because healthcare is an issue of class, like gender, and also like socioeconomic status. And I think that it's not a coincidence that a lot of minorities who are locked into lower class positions because of the way America works, and a lot of like poor women of color have been kind of locked out of this. I also think that in the context of criminal justice reform, kind of talking about something that's we've talked about a little bit, but people don't feel like, I feel like people aren't realizing the urgency for, is like the unique risk COVID-19 has to prisons. We've seen that like first, there's no social distancing in prisons. Second, like COVID-19 is just like even just the forefront of this. There are HIV and AIDS outbreaks in prisons that happen right now, that have been happening for years and stuff like that, and we don't really, like, we weren't really paying attention because it was blood, but also like doesn't spread as quickly as that. But even then, that kind of puts into perspective like the conditions of prisons. But also something that I feel like people don't realize is that a lot of prisons have been the site of biomedical experimentation. Like people experiment on prisoners. They try to do treatments and stuff like that on them, which is like a unique, like really messed up form of exploitation, stuff like that. But people need to realize, I guess, also within those communities, because like a lot of those private prisons are a symptom of like broader like messed up stuff that capitalism happens. A lot of those private prisons are in suburban areas or urban areas where those economies are really closed off from everyone. So like prison guards are coming back to their homes and then they're spreading it. Like it just touches every single community. It's very interconnected. I hope that answers the question.
Do you think specifically, is that something we should be mindful of when we're talking about kind of developing a vaccine or a kind of a cure for?
I mean, it kind of shows you, like, I feel like people are very excited for a vaccine. Of course, I am too. I would like COVID-19 to be over as quickly as possible, but I feel like people need to realize that this is going to stay with us for a while, and this is going to mess up a lot of parts of our country. Like, how do you expect COVID-19 to go away when millions of people, like, are locked up? In terms of, like, it's going to spread a bunch, and like it's going to, and the way that vaccines work, like people who have more access tend to get them first. Those people are going to be the last people to get it. So like it's gonna like get bad. Like I feel like something that people are really fatalistic nowadays when they look at like oppression, like, oh, it's just a different manifestation of this. And I agree, there are things that just fundamentally shift in society, and kind of we see how they like exploit themselves. But it doesn't mean things can get worse. Like it can always get worse. And that's why we should be urgent.
Isha, I know you wanted to add in this as well. Is there anything you want to say, or has it already kind of been?
Yeah, I think I started off with the question, but yeah, I think it's just to echo what everyone else says. I think there's a lot of issues that come with COVID and like systems of oppression. So yeah.
Really quickly before we go on to the next question, just for anyone that is new here, hello. If you want to say anything to any of our panelists, you can go to the chat button down there at the bottom next to share screen. And if you want to ask a question for our Q&A for the last 30 minutes, you can go down bottom right corner. This is the Q&A, type it in, and we'll all be able to see it, and we will answer it. If you're on Facebook Live, just type it in the chat there, and it will get to us. Cool. Okay. Now we'll move on to our next question. This one is a little bit more related to the crisis at hand instead of the virus, but kind of as a blanket statement, there's been a lot of confusion about kind of what exactly the term defund the police means. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. So what does the term defund the police mean to you, Milo?
Yeah, I guess personally, from my perspective, it's a stepstone to an actual goal for me personally, prison abolition. I think that defunding the police objectively is a good thing. We should be defunding and moving resources away from like moving resources from policing to education and stuff like that. Because like literally we know we have a bunch of statistics on how increased education, increased social work, increased healthcare, like that, and increased housing, that like prevents crime. That's just like an objectively true statement. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to like refute that. I think that there are some things where like, at least in my perspective, I think that we have things like 8 Can Wait and those types of social media campaigns that have like broader reform things like for example, like body cameras and stuff like that, which are good. But I guess for me, when I've analyzed it and seen how it's like been done, it's ended up like strengthening the policing system. For example, in the context of body cameras, what we've seen is first, body cameras can be just completely optional for police officers. They can turn it off, or they can literally just hold the footage and stuff like that. So when we mean like defund the police, I think that it's good in terms of moving towards like investing in our social institutions within the status quo. So we eventually just have a world like without policing and crime, because like if people have access to resources, they just don't have a need. They don't have a need for it.
Does anyone else have a different view of it that is, different, or there's parts the same? Anything else they want to add on to that?
I think that Milo has hit nail on the head pretty much. I mean, I don't think the statement needs to be defund the police. I think the statement needs to be defund the police and allocate the funds towards the community. Education, especially in poor neighborhoods, would help reduce crime by a lot, because it would hopefully decrease the number of high school dropouts, increase the number of people that are able to go and get an education in college or something like that. All these good things that just aren't happening right now.
Nia, what about you?
Yeah, I really think defund the police to me means just like literally almost exactly what Maya said, like taking those funds and reallocating them to something that is going to help. Because the reason why people commit crimes is because they're lacking in something. The reason why people do anything is because they need something. So by putting those resources to something that people can actually use, social work, education, etc., we would be lessening this crime. Therefore, the need for the police would be lessened too. I think I am very big advocate for social work. I think we should be putting a lot of funds towards that, because in low-income communities, there is a lack of social work. There's a lack of education, and quality education, I should say, that is contributing to a lot of the facts why we have all these bad statistics in these low-income communities. So by putting these funds there, I think we could really solve a lot of problems. Therefore, defunding the police would be part of that.
Do you guys think that having kind of two things. One, the police unions, and 2, qualified immunity. Do you think those are kind of talk about those, opinions on them, etc.? I don't want to reveal too much. I want you guys to.
Qualified immunity needs to be immediately removed, in my opinion, because it just says because you have this special job, that means it's part of the job. That shooting somebody in the back is not part of the job. For example, like cops to me should be held to the same standards as doctors and nurses when they mess up on the job. Like if a doctor accidentally kills a patient or something like that, they could have their license revoked. They are no longer allowed to practice medicine after, 10 plus years of education, which is another thing to highlight about becoming a police officer. It should take way longer to become a police officer, because it currently in some states, you need more training to become a, I don't even know what it's called, but hairstylist, a certified hairstylist. Then it takes more hours to become a hairstylist than it does to become a police officer.
I actually didn't realize. Oh yeah, Marley, do you want to add on to this?
Yeah, I just want to add real quick. I think I saw something today that was like, 37 cities in America have named some street in their town Black Lives Matter, or painted it somewhere, but only one of those 37 have actually ended qualified immunity. And it just shows that there's a lot of performative activism like going on, and there are real steps that we can take, and some people are just ignoring that. And I think that what's wrong is that sometimes we see a city like naming a street Black Lives Matter, and we're like, great, good for them, we're making progress. But in reality, that's not really progress. And what's really progress is defunding the police, ending qualified immunity. And I absolutely think that there's just a lot of people don't really look into what defunding the police actually means and like what those things mean. And I think that that's more, it's really important to look into like how we allocate those other other funds and how we end qualified immunity instead of just like saying it and not really understanding it.
I think just because of time reasons, we'll have to go on to the next question. Thanks so much, everyone, for answering those. This one gets a little bit more into the meat of the policing system as it exists. So, how do you guys think that prison reform should occur, and how does the dismantlement of the prison industrial complex connect to this current struggle? We'll go to Wiley for this one.
Yeah, so I think that there's a fundamental issue with our prisons in what they're prioritizing. I think that we as a country prioritize punishing people rather than rehabilitating them. And not only is that sort of immoral, but it's also very ineffective. Like we have a record high recidivism rate in the US. People come out of jail with little to no opportunities because of their criminal record. They can't vote, they can't get a job, so they just end up going back to jail. And I think that's definitely by design. I mean, that's the prison industrial complex at work. So I think first and foremost, if we're going to reform prisons, we have to change that, like what we're prioritizing in prisons. And I also think on an even more specific level, we need to end prison labor so that people, like we as a nation don't have, or companies and the government don't have an incentive to put people in jail in order to exploit their labor in a modern form of slavery. Both of those things are pretty much essential, I think, if we're going to reform prisons at any level.
Jordan, I know you wanted to add to this.
Wiley said pretty well, in my opinion. The rate people go back. When you're a felon, you can no longer vote. You can no longer get a job, basically, because you're a felon. You go back to selling drugs or something like that. You get caught. You end up in prison again, and there's no way out almost from that. Another thing is the private prisons do not need to be a thing as well, and simply because the motive of private prisons is to generate profit, not to, as Wiley said, rehabilitate people and get them back to, upstanding citizen status. That's all.
Okay, so I thought I interrupted you. Thank you, Jordan, for that. Does anyone want to touch on the school to prison pipeline and how that kind of connects to what we were just talking about in terms of the prison industrial complex?
I could talk about that. I think that Marley really did a really good job of bringing that up early in the conversation, because I feel like people don't talk about the school to prison pipeline. Something that I got to personally got into just on researching the school to prison pipeline is kind of specifically the criminalization of Black girls in the context of the school to prison pipeline. Something that I feel like people don't talk about in terms of how the presence of police in schools in general. There is no reason why you should have a police officer in a school classroom or an area. If there is, that needs to be a problem of the broader institution, and you need to interrogate why those things exist. But I do think that because of the nature of policing and how it's evolved with slavery, there is an inextricable tie between anti-Blackness and racism against Black people specifically, but also other racialized minorities and also the police, so that they are perceived as more aggressive. And I feel like people who bear a lot of the brunt with this are Black women and also darker skinned POC who are perceived as more aggressive. And that kind of ties into our stereotypes of Black girls being more adult. The term is adultification. So there are a lot of cases of just Black girls literally being tackled in schools, and part of those suspensions that happen eventually lead them to go to prison, or they sentence them and send them to prison. For example, there was a recent case of this Black girl, specifically in the pandemic, wasn't able to do her homework. I'm not going to question why she didn't do her homework. I've probably not done some homework during the pandemic, because newsflash, we're in a pandemic. That's not your first obligation. But I think she is going to go to prison for that and go to some type of juvenile prison. That's really messed up. And we've seen in a lot of cases that happens to Black girls specifically, and a lot of Black boys, but also people of color. It's kind of a part part and parcel, that kind of just facilitates and shows how we sustain the prison, kind of like in a even more messed up way. We really want people when they're young, and that kind of just facilitates it. And when people wonder why people have high recidivism rates, partly in the fact that, like, once you go to prison, you can't work in some places. They just won't let you go places. But people don't understand how this is like a cycle, and this like allows people and traps them when they're young. So I think that's key when we think about education and dismantling the prison industrial complex, because if you like, you can't just allocate funding to schools but not take out police out of schools, because then you'll just like police kids and send them to the jail. Like, that has to be a part of our conversation.
I would love to have more of a conversation on this, but unfortunately we are running out of time in our, this, I don't know what to call it, but this question part of it. So we're going to the next question. Who have you looked to for guidance during these times in terms of, like, politicians, popular figures, stuff like that? And then please, for anyone that would like to answer, keep it a little bit brief, just because the questions after this are going to be probably lengthy, I'd assume. So we'll start with Isha for this one.
Yeah, so I kind of look to comedians. Personally, I get a lot of my news from there, just like in entertaining form, and I feel like a lot of comedians at this point, especially like Black and people of color comedians, have really stepped up into the forefront and kind of like owned that and said like they've really been vocal about like the issues, but like also in an engaging and like fun format, and that's like personally been a really nice form of guidance and like entertaining guidance too.
Thank you for that, Isha. Milo, I know you also wanted to share a couple.
Something that I feel like people don't like. I feel like you guys should, for anyone here, you guys should be you guys should be reading people who are in prison writings, period. George Jackson, Asaj Shakur, Angela Davis. CeCe McDonald is a really good activist. She was a Black trans woman who was thrown in jail. She wrote a bunch of prison letters in the beginning of like captive genders. It's this broader book, but I think just like hearing people from prison and their voices, I feel like we have a lot of representation in terms of the diversity of prison, how it affects people, but we're not listening to, a lot of times we're not hearing prisoners, which I would really like us to hear.
Thank you, Milo and Isha, for those general people that we should be looking for and listening to. Now moving into people closer to home, living in the South, have you all had interactions with people who are, part of the, I guess, All Lives Matter camp? And how have you kind of dealt with their ignorance of the issue? And if you've been able to, how have you kind of combated it and maybe even convinced them as why their reasoning is wrong? We'll start with Nia for this one.
So yeah, I've had many interactions with All Lives Matter people. It was a point where like I love posting all my Instagram stories, because I do my research. I research my posts before I post them, but I like posting the ones that actually have real information. And there was a point where I would be posting and it would be like the same 4 people every single day, just swiping up, trying to negate the opinions that I'm putting out there. And I've learned that you cannot argue with everyone. Sometimes ignorance is just extremely strong. I think that you can try to get through to them. However, for yourself and to keep yourself sane, I don't think it's like specifically a good idea to just, constantly just try to like argue with them. However, I think by educating yourself and by going and researching your topics, listening to those podcasts, reading the prison transcripts and everything like that, you get a good sense of what to tell people whenever they try to negate your opinion. And it's not like oh, I know better than you. It's no, these are facts, these are statistics, you can look them up yourself, but this is the truth. And that's what I personally have done, just to, whenever someone comes at me in that way, just push those facts to them, push those statistics to them, and try to get them to see. And if you don't, okay. But I helped, I did my part, and now the ball is in your court in order to help yourself and help me.
Luke, I know you've also had similar experiences. Do you want to share how you've dealt with them?
Yeah, I guess just because of my personality, a lot of times I do get engaged in these kind of conversations and kind of debates between me and All Lives Matter people. And for me, something that I've come to the conclusion that it's more because of the way they think that they take the all lives matter position. They think, I guess this is a bit off center of the question, but they kind of think the world is a hierarchy of people who are born into this almost hierarchy of, you know, how good you are, whether it be like a business owner or politician. And they think that Black Lives Matter is trying to disrupt the hierarchy and, you know, I guess move people between levels. And for me, coming to that conclusion, being able like recognizing how they think has let me better, you know, convince them to swap sides or just kind of, you know, poke holes in the way that they think. And I think that it's not because you're not going to get a ton of people to swap thinking from all lives matter to Black Lives Matter unless you change the way they think about all lives matter or Black Lives Matter. And so for me, at least, it's more not really been dealing with ignorance, but more dealing with like, because they see the news, it's more dealing with how they perceive the news and what they think about it.
I know, Jordan, you also have had similar experiences with Nia and Luke. Do you want to add on to what they're saying at all?
My favorite retort to all lives matter is all lives matter cannot matter until Black Lives Matter. That's just where I start the conversation. It's like, you cannot see George Floyd's death and say that, and see Eric Garner's death, Trayvon Martin's death, Philando Castile's death, and you cannot say that there is not an active force or system in the U.S. that exists to oppress Black people, Black and brown people per se. And if they can't not even agree on that with me, honestly, then I'm just like, this is a lost cause. Number one. Number two, but if they do agree with me, I'm like, well, if you believe that this system of oppression exists and you believe that all lives matter, why are you not yelling for all these people, all these Black people, if you care about all lives so much? And it's generally, I mean, there's a lot of mental gymnastics I feel that goes on inside their heads, but I generally try and take a reasonable, calm approach and just be nice and try to be understanding.
Yeah, thank you three for these great responses. We have 2 questions left. We're going to try to get through them as best we can, and then we'll move into the Q&A. So as I said earlier, Q&A box, go ahead and type in there, Facebook Live. They will get to us, and we'll try to answer them. Cool. So next question is a little bit more, you know, vision-based, broad scale. What do you see as the next best kind of broad steps of action that we should take to achieve a truly equal society? And that can be, you know, legislation or, you know, local versus national. Just it's very open. Wiley, we'll start with you.
So yeah, obviously there's not like one policy that dismantles systemic racism, but there are like, you know, systems that exist now that we can not easily dismantle, but could do a lot of good if dismantled. So I think that we can functionally end the war on drugs probably just through a broad decriminalization of drug possession, which works in both a like preventing people from going to jail sense and also a treating drug addiction as an illness rather than a crime that can be treated. Portugal did it a couple decades ago, and it seems to be working pretty well for them. I also think, as I said earlier, abolishing prison labor, ending qualified immunity, ending the death penalty, getting rid of mandatory minimums, ending bail. I also think that universal basic income is probably a good thing in that sense, in a more holistic scale level, just because, you know, we've all sort of collectively agreed that the reason people commit crimes is sort of driven by scarcity. And I think if people had at least some sort of a higher floor in terms of their income, they would be a lot less driven to, you know, commit crimes. They wouldn't be, you know, they wouldn't need to do that.
Milo, I know you also had something to add to this. Would you like to?
Yeah, I really agree with what Wiley talks about in terms of a broad decriminalization of drugs. Because I guess in the context of mandatory minimums, I think 58% of them are just drug offenses, which is like ridiculous. Another thing that I feel like should be legalized is sex work in general, because like a bunch of like just like a bunch of people go to jail for sex work, and also in the context of like transphobia, a lot of Black trans women, a lot of trans women in general, are just labeled as sex workers and then like thrown in jail. Not to say that there is anything inherently bad about being it, but you can see that with that criminalization of like prostitution and stuff like that, there kind of shows kind of like there are a lot of like kind of icky stuff in terms of how we perceive specific women and specific people to be more valuable to our society versus not to be. Something that I also guess would like to see is probably an end to the death penalty. I think that within deconstructing these broader forms of oppression, we need to respect different ways of moving, but also know that we cannot move in just one way to end those types of oppressions. Voting is good. I'm going to say that. Vote and like get people out of office. Like if you can get Steve King out of office, like I'm not going to tell you not to vote him out. That's like mind-blowingly dumb. But like also like just go on different ways. You need to go to protests. You need to be organizing within your community and stuff like that. So on a broader level, I want legal reforms, but I also would like to see people mobilizing and organizing and creating their own institutions and support networks.
Does anyone have anything they want to add to what Wiley and Milo said? We're kind of strapped for time here, but if there's anything else you want to say, please go for it.
I'll make it quick. Like Milo said, the death penalty, it heavily discriminates against Black and brown people because of, you know, on average, Black people and brown people cannot afford a lawyer, for example. Well, can afford a lawyer less, you know what I'm trying to say. My point is, it discriminates against Black and brown people, and therefore a lot of people, you know, who are even innocent go and get the electric chair, no reason. Number one. Number two, as Wiley said earlier, prison should be more about, you know, rehabilitation more than punishment. And the death penalty does not exist as anything other than punishment. Reagan-era Nixon and Reagan-era drug laws, such as mandatory minimums, need to be definitely repealed as well.
Thank you, Jordan, Milo, and Wiley for providing the greater framework going into the final question. So this one is for everyone. And it is, what is the future of the South? And then under that, what is one takeaway and action step that the audience should take, you know, as soon as they can? So we'll start with Luke on this one.
I think for the future of the South, as a lot of people kind of hammered on earlier, is to continue the kind of heritage of progress, the kind of history like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and a ton of different activists, and a lot of activist action has come from the South. I think that should definitely be the future of the South. We could be a hotspot driven by people watching or panelists here. But for the audience, I think that one thing that needs to be done is everyone take a deep look within themselves and a consideration about not only what they think, why they think that way, what they support, why they support it, and if they shouldn't support it. I think everything should be seen with through a lens of criticism, so you can at the very least understand why and what you're supporting. I know a lot of people do things and they don't mean to do anything wrong, but they just never considered it. And I think that when it comes to issues like race, when systems of oppression are so intertwined with the way we live and the systems that we live within, that it really does take a deep personal consideration in thinking about what you're doing, what you're thinking, what you're saying, and who you support. So
thank you, Luke. We'll go to Isha next.
Yeah, I think that the future is definitely dependent on our generation, and I think there's a lot of positive signs that we can really enact change and make progress. And I think that a huge part of it is getting outside of your own bubble and reaching out, gaining new information and different perspectives. And yeah, I think that our generation is definitely headed in the right direction.
We'll go to Jordan next.
I think the southeastern U.S. in particular could, make a lot of young activists simply because of the culture that exists within the Southeast, especially surrounding, the Confederacy and overt racism. So, as I said, I think that's a good thing, honestly, because we've had this history of racism, and like Luke said, racism and Southern history are very intertwined in the way we live. But I think that it'll create a bunch of young activists, and I think that's a good thing. And I think with a bunch of young activists, there was bound to be change, good change.
We'll go to Marley next.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that the South is moving in a really great direction. And I think that there's a lot of work to do, but I think that especially like us, if we promise to like not to give up on that kind of work, then we're going to get there eventually. And it's going to be really hard, but like we're going to get there. And I think that like there's a lot of things you can do conceptually, and like a lot of things that the government can do, like that can fix whatever problems we have. Like we can look at our privilege and everything. But I think one really concrete thing that like makes you feel like you're doing something is signing petitions. I think it's really easy. I think it's a really great way to just solidify your beliefs and get your voice out there. So I would encourage, just as a concrete thing to do today, is to like go to White House petitions, find one that needs to reach its goal, and like sign it. I know specifically the Justice for Bernal Trammell has not gotten to its goal yet, and I think that that's one really easy thing that you can do today, and it's just makes a lot of sense.
We'll go to Nia next.
I think to understand what the future of the South is, you kind of have to understand that one of my favorite sayings too is a stitch in time saves 9. What we do now can save a lot of people in the future. Not even save, but affect a lot of people in the future. Just like what the activists before our time, Martin Luther, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, what they did, their activism and their rallies helped us now. So we need to continue that in order for the future of the South to remain in positive motion. And I really call to a lot of people, like I love reading, and I just would say find those people that are pushing out, those books and those podcasts. I personally love No Name Reads on Instagram. That is her handle. She's one of my favorite artists, Black artist. She's amazing, and she has a book club, and her books are awesome. I've been reading them all summer, and they really go about what we're trying to do now and the message we're trying to send now among everything that's happening. So.
We'll go to Wiley next.
I'm very optimistic, and maybe this is something that every generation feels, but I feel like our generation specifically is one that's going to be an agent of change, because I think that the times that we live in now are particularly chaotic and sort of scary, but I think that the upside of that is that it's informing people and making people think more about things that they previously had not thought about. Like I think, the ideas we discussed here, the fact that ideas like decriminalizing all drugs are being discussed, even though they're definitely not like mainstream American political ideas, the fact that they're being discussed, I think, is meaningful. And in terms of advice for the audience, I mean, first of all, you're here, which is good. Like participating and watching things like this, I think is super helpful just in terms of informing yourself. And yeah, I think just being generally informed and then, voting and protesting and just, don't tune out, because that's what the people in charge want you to do, right? That's my philosophy.
And we'll end off with Maiwa today.
Yeah. So the future of the South to me is a divestment from institutions of policing. It doesn't mean it means that like within individually like stuff that we can do. It means that not automatically calling the police if we see something that could be solved with us, engaging with our communities, mutual aid networks. In the South, realistically, we can't do a ton of stuff because I get that we are in red states, but if we eventually divest through ourselves, but also engaging in those legal type of forms like local elections, but also organizing, connecting with underprivileged communities, for example, like queer folks, women of color, people of color, and people who are vulnerable to those superstructures, we can create a change.
Yeah, thank you to all of our panelists today for responding to the questions that I've said. Now we're going to move on to the questions that you all have submitted in the audience. Just a reminder to the panelists what we went over earlier in terms of so we don't all answer at the same time. Yeah, so we'll go to the ones in the Q&A box first. So this one comes from an anonymous attendee, but what and how can a school culture in terms of elementary, middle, high, K through 12 be more conducive to a more equitable and inclusive agenda? And do you think that your school is on the right track or place to do that? We'll go with Marley first for this.
I think that the schooling system is like it's very complex. There's a lot that goes into it, and I think that one of the most important things is that there's this public school system in America has not been built for non-white folks. Like it's been so colonized. The curriculum is so colonized, and I think that that's one thing is that what I've noticed a lot of is that I don't go to public school, and I know that a lot of us here don't, but I've noticed that a lot of my friends they don't learn about Malcolm X. They don't learn about the civil rights movement happened right here in our city, and they don't know about it, or they don't read Black authors. They don't read from queer authors. Like they only read from white straight men like that. And that's a huge problem, I think, because you're not hearing that kind of perspective. Like you're not learning what you need to learn to change the systems, and so you're not going to get there. And I think that's a really big problem. And I think just building more representation of, Black folks, non-white folks, queer folks, all of the above, I think that's really important. I also think that, there's a whole school to prison pipeline, and that I think mostly comes from redlining, is that there's a lot of public schools in redline neighborhoods that just don't have the resources that they need to have their kids succeed. And that's why we have such a high rate of people from those neighborhoods going to prison. And that's part of kind of defunding the police and reallocating those funds to schools in those neighborhoods that are usually over-policed, taking that money away from that police and bringing it to their schools, because there's just no need for police there if they're not even going to get through school. And there's just this whole vicious system. And it really comes from like the fact that schools were not built to support Black people, and they weren't built to support Hispanic people, and they just weren't built to support that. And I think that rethinking the whole way that we do public school is really important. For me personally, going to private school, I have had more control over my curriculum, and that's been really great. And that's a privilege that I have, and that many people in my city don't.
Thank you for that, Marley. We'll go to Nia next on this one.
Yeah, I go to a public school out here in Katy, Texas, and I would definitely say my experience in school is not anything that I've also been to a private school, and the difference in like education is so huge. And I understand that teachers are oftentimes, especially public school teachers, are bound to a certain curriculum that they have to teach. But I think it's not only up to them, because not to put all that responsibility on them, but up to the students, especially middle school, high school students, educate yourself, but also for teachers to let their students know that there's something else out there. The textbook you're reading is not the only source of information that there is in the world. Like people are oftentimes quick to say that the school information that you're given in these textbooks are something that it's, your diehard truth. That's what I'm going to argue with. But there's so much more information. I think just for teachers to be tell their students, hey, there's other things, there's other people, there's other different groups that can be represented that aren't here, is very important for people to understand and be more inclusive in schools.
We'll finish off this question with an answer from Wiley.
Yeah, so I'm kind of a history nerd, and my specific issue, obviously everything that Marley and Ian said has been absolutely correct, but I think that in a lot of schools, especially in the South, it's not just what people aren't being told, it's what they are. And I think specifically with things like the Civil War, we have an issue in the South where our curriculum is, public school curriculum is decided by the state, right? So the view of specifically the Civil War we get is one that is skewed in a Southern perspective and just historically inaccurate. And I think a lot of the reason that we have issues in the South probably it's definitely not all that, but I think that contributes to how people view our modern day issues, and how, because they don't see it as much of a historical thread from, slavery to now, because of the view that they've been given.
Thank you, Wiley, Nia, and Marley, for the answer to that question. We're going to move on to another one. With this one, I'm going to ask that all of our panelists stick to a minute or less for responses. That's not a hard line, but just so we can get through as many of these as possible. We'll go with one from Facebook Live. So it is, how can us somewhat older folks help motivate younger voters to vote? It's well documented that voting rates are very low in the 18 to 30-year-old demographic, and that makes us have an old white political class because old white people vote at much higher rates. And research shows that shame is not a factor that motivates people to vote. So what is your guys' opinion on that? We'll go with Mila first for this one.
I think that it's a question of also like first continuing to vote, but also like facilitating voter registration programs in your area. For example, contextual to Nashville, we have the Mayor's Youth Council, which tries to register people to vote. I won't deny that there are specific things that are happening. For example, in Nashville, there's this really weird law passed by the state legislature that basically made it, if we didn't accidentally register, or like if we did mistakes in terms of those registrations, they could throw out the entirety and like ban our organizations from it. So I think that there are other stuff in play in terms of access to those things, but just like continuing to facilitate and fund those organizations in your like areas that are trying to register people to vote, but also reminding young people, because I feel like a lot of people our age are very fatalistic and nihilistic in terms of like how politics works. I understand there's like reason to be, but tell them that like there are like cases of change happening due to voting. Like it's just true.
Thank you, Maya, for that. We'll go to Luke next on this question.
Yeah, I know my dad is very involved in politics, and he's always told me to vote no matter how, to Milo's point, I have been a bit nihilistic about it. But I still see my brother thinking it's kind of, worthless to vote. But I think what really did it for me was when my dad mentioned things like I forgot the exact election, but Al Gore, how he lost in Florida by just a few thousand votes. I think those examples are always good to show that, a vote does have a lot of power. So I think personally, just, I guess, informing about, the power of a vote and that it is an opportunity to change things.
Thank you, Luke and Mila, for answering that one. We're going to move on to the next one now. This one is another anonymous one. This kind of relates to something we were talking about earlier in the question section. But do you largely think that the transformational society changes are like, oppression, racial justice, etc., are going to come from a generational movement? And or how do you think about changing the hearts and minds of older Americans? Do you guys have any examples of getting in, political arguments and being able to kind of move past them with uncles, aunts, grandparents, stuff like that? I'll go to Marley first for this one.
And I think it's a really interesting kind of dynamic because you can kind of relate the way that, Gen Z kind of relates to the older generations with the kind of way that the North relates to the South. Sometimes we think that we can't change old people's minds. Like we can't change our parents' minds. If they're stuck in their ways, like we're not going to change their minds. And I think that while sometimes is true, I have met many adults who just are stuck in their ways. But I also think that, that's just kind of, it's giving up on them. And it's just kind of like, they're going to go out and vote. Obviously, the most people who are voting are old white people. And like, it's important that we at least try, like get in those conversations the same way you would get into these conversations with people your age. I think that what will happen is that it'll mostly be kind of it'll be this generation, and like millennials and Gen Z will do the most of the grunt work. But I think that doesn't mean we can't try and get older people involved. It's not like they're a lost cause. We don't want to treat them the same way that the North has been treating the South kind of way.
I know Luke also wanted to tap in on this question. Luke, what do you have to add?
Yeah, I'll be quick about it for you, Michael, but just like a little bit at a time. I know some people might call it gaslighting, but a little bit at a time, a little like thing here and there, it like over time will like change people's minds. I think just like a little comment about this, a little comment about that. I think that can change a bit older people's minds, one issue at a time kind of thing. So.
Thank you, Luke and Marley, for answering that question. We have another question coming in from an anonymous attendee. What effects do you think that the mixture of religion in the U.S., specifically the kind of split between Catholicism, Protestantism, and then more generally just the diversity in religion in the U.S. and their relationship to manifest destiny in the colonialism and kind of creation of the modern American state have on today's issues like racism, sexism, etc.? We'll go to Maya first for this one.
I think it's a really good question. I feel like something that people kind of like don't talk a lot about, because in terms of like of course, there's like within internal divisions within like ideas of Islamophobia, kind of like ideas of manifest destiny. But I think that we kind of need to think about, in a sense, like kind of like, I think where we think about religion in terms of like the history of how we got to this point. For example, like I feel like something that's really interesting, kind of a conversation with with specifically Black folks in terms of our relationship to religion, because in the context of how the world operated, we don't have our original religions that we had coming into this country because of like how we were forcibly came here. I feel like that's really interesting when we talk about like kind of like specifically Black folks' relationship to religion. And I think that we see a lot of these religious practices being occurring when we specifically, like intervention into the Middle East, I feel like is a really good example of using types of manifest destiny. For example, I think it was George Bush, when they asked him like his justification for like intervention in the Middle East, he literally said, I had a vision from God or something like that. And I think you can see types of stuff, like it's not as explicit as that, but even like missionary trips that you take on Instagram and stuff like that, you like posing with little Black children or little brown children, stuff like that, that's a form of manifest destiny and neocolonialism. So I feel like when privileged folks need to deconstruct, like thinking about like kind of like how we contribute to that, how are we using our religion in a way to like, I guess, like are we aiding those systems of oppression? Are we doing this in a meaningful way? Is what we're doing productive even? I don't know. I feel like that's a broader conversation.
Marley, I know you wanted to add to that as well.
Yeah, and I think this is a really complicated question and like conversation that is not easy to flesh out in just a minute. But I think that definitely Christianity and colonialism have a very tight relationship, and that is not necessarily like a bad thing or a generalization, but it's certainly one of the driving forces for a lot of people to do things that are hateful or that discriminate against others. And I know as someone who is not a Christian, like I've experienced that firsthand, like people just imagining that there's this hierarchy. And I think that that's really important to realize that there's also, I think some people think of race and religion as mutually exclusive, that each religion is a composite of one race, and that's just absolutely not true. So I think that we need to like kind of not separate the ideas of race and religion in our minds and kind of realize that there's this intersectionality in them.
Thank you, Marley. We'll go to Jordan next. I know he wanted to respond to this.
The whole concept of religion and in American issues is a very, 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 very broad topic. But just to start, I would say that a lot of America's issues with religion, to me, have stemmed from people being, for example, Christian. This is my belief. I'm Christian myself, and I sometimes hate calling myself that because of the type of people I associate myself with when I say I'm Christian. But like the quote unquote true Christian thing to do is not to hate gay people, not to hate Black people, and not to like do all this other stuff that, white evangelicals are kind of notorious for doing, I guess if that's the right word. But to actually, treat each other with respect, basic human decency, like the whole what would Jesus thing do? What would Jesus do type thing. But I think also that, manifest destiny, there's this Christian people have this feeling that, oh, because I'm Christian, I'm always right sometimes. And it's just, I think we need to, as a Christian myself, I think we need to remove ourselves from the label of Christian from ourselves and think, is what we're doing, a decent thing to do? That was poorly worded, but you get what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Marley, Jordan, and Maiwa, for the responses to that question. We're going to have time for about 2-3 more, I think. So next we have a question coming in from another anonymous attendee asking, is there any leader or emerging leader, and doesn't have to be in politics, who you personally admire and want to work with, or just admire the work of and want to kind of share what they're currently doing? We will go to Wiley first for this question.
This is not going to be a obscure choice, but I find AFC to be very inspiring and intelligent, and she's very, she's both. I think she represents everything that a politician should be. She's very like involved in her community. She's very friendly, but she's also very like passionate for what she believes in.
Jordan, I know you wanted to also tap into this question.
Personally, if I could vote, I would have voted Bernie Sanders in the primaries, but I think Bernie Sanders is one of my favorite politicians to ever exist, simply because he's been saying the same thing. He's been saying these things that are, he's been an LGBTQ ally. He's been an ally with Black people, all these other marginalized groups since like the 60s and 80s. He was arrested for protesting in the 60s. There's a picture of him that's been going around recently. He actually gave this dude a speech basically when he called gay people homos in the Senate in 1985 in the midst of the AIDS crisis. And I just respect somebody that, the way that Black and brown and gay, all these other marginalized groups are treated, has no effect on his life whatsoever because he's a straight white guy. And the fact that he goes out of his way to try and defend these groups and become an ally is just inspiring to me.
We'll go to Nia next on this one.
Yes, I definitely just want to add what Wiley said about AOC. She has definitely been the woman I look to whenever just, as someone that's a role model for what a politician should be, as Wiley said. And I love the fact that she is a POC woman and a woman, period. I feel like there is a huge lacking in any government system of women, and especially POC women. And the fact that she's setting such a great model for what one can be and what one can do is just amazing. I love what she does for her community, and she's definitely been the person I've looked to.
We'll wrap up this question with Mila.
I guess on an electoral level, I agree with Nia, Wiley, and everyone. AOC is great. But I guess on like a more political activist level, I already mentioned her before, but Cece McDonald is a Black trans activist who was basically wrongfully incarcerated when like a basically white supremacist tried to murder her. And I got to like meet and talk to her over the summer, and she's like on like a first level, possibly one of the most favorite people I've ever met in my life in terms of like the way she organizes and the way she talks. And I feel like, I don't know, I really loved her prison writings. I feel like it's really personal and really nice, but also like, I feel like it kind of like broadened me in terms of a call to action, because I feel like a lot of people, when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we are very much focused on Black cis white men, and we don't focus on Black trans men, Black queer people of color. And Cece's story like really resonated with me, but also showed that like we need to be like inclusive. Like when Black trans women stop being killed, like we will like literally allow no one will be killed, kind of like diversifying our message, but also like addressing kind of like systemic oppression and also like anti-queer violence within the Black community. Because I feel like for me personally, I've seen just like that's really prevalent and we need to address that.
Thank you, everyone who responded to that question. We're going to move into our final question of the day. Unfortunately, we cannot get to all of them, but I think this one right here is a really good question to end on, so I'm going to end on it. So this one comes from another anonymous attendee asking, we can talk about institutional and systemic oppression and racism all day long, but this person who asked the question is interested in how each of us will personally move forward to take action every day from here on out. And they're specifically curious on how you specifically feel as though you can make a difference in your local, state, national communities. Yeah, that is the question. Actually, I'm going to ask as a good wrap up, we'll have everyone answer this question if you guys are comfortable with that. Is there anyone that wants to go first for that one?
I can do it.
All right, let's go. Jordan.
But yeah, I think the main thing that I've started doing is calling out my friends, for saying things that just aren't right. Like the other day, this lesbian woman came into my workplace and he called her a slur, and I was like, you don't do that, dude. It's like, it's disrespectful, it's not right, and why would you do that? I had a conversation with him basically after about it. And I think I changed his mind about it. I'm not 100% sure, but I was just like, you don't do that. It's disrespectful and unnecessary.
We'll go to Nia next on this question.
I definitely plan on, I'm involved in a lot of clubs at my school that are related to the type of topics that we talked about today, and I definitely plan on being a lot more active in those. and just on like a social level with my friends, you know, just saying, hey, you know, this is wrong. Like, let me tell you something, you know, things like that.
We'll go to Marley next.
I think every day continuing to check my privilege and what I can do. Also using my platform that I've been given as someone who is a leader in youth group and in school, using that platform for good. And also, though I'm not old enough to vote yet, continuing to register people I know to vote and to research politicians who I think can do a good job and continuing to vote for those in the future.
We'll go to Mila next.
I guess in terms of like where I am, I help lead Albany, which is Diversity Alliance in my school. So I'll continue to be active in terms of that. I guess like allowing, like kind of pestering our institutions to see like curriculum change and stuff like that. Calling out people, voting, and also donating to organizations that do racial justice work and mutual aid networks, and donating to people who are like underprivileged within our community through like GoFundMes or like Cash App and Venmo, which is a really good way to support those people.
We'll go to Wiley next.
Yeah, I recently turned 18, so voting, I think that's super important. Staying up to date on what's going on, what's happening, what the problems are, what progress is being made, what progress isn't being made. And then, yeah, like calling out people around you and sort of fighting the urge to just stay silent under like peer pressure or whatever. Just, you know, putting your values above, you know, maybe seeming out of place.
We'll go to Isha next.
Yeah, just to echo what everyone else said, voting is super important, especially like locally in primaries and citywide elections. And I also think that like calling out and continuing to have like difficult conversations within your family or friend group is really important.
And we will end right where we started with Luke.
I will just make this brief, just try to continue to have conversations, whether that be in schools, whether that be with people within institutions, whether that be with friends, whether that be with family. Continue to have conversations because that helps lead to solutions, gets everyone involved, and, you know, this is a great place to start. So.
Yeah, thank you so much to all of our panelists for participating today, and to the Q&A people for submitting questions. I will pass it off to Summer now to wrap us up. You're muted, sorry.
Thanks. Well, I said, wow. I said, I don't know if you could read my lips, but wow. That was brilliant. The past 90 minutes, I learned so much. Thank you, each and every one of you. That was very powerful. And I feel like we could go on for much longer. And I heard each one of you say conversations several times, which is one of the reasons why we called our organization Millions of Conversations, because it starts with a conversation. And we want to continue those conversations. I will let you know that this has been recorded, and it will be available across all of our different social media channels on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn. And you can follow us at A Million Convos, and that's where the video will be placed. And I hope you will all stay in touch with us. We need your voices, we need your opinions, we need your energy, and we need your power. So thank you. And words don't describe the past 90 minutes. Thank you. And that concludes our programming. Thank you.